We have an amazing group of panelists today. The topic for today's discussion is inclusive design and the cycle of privilege. Dr. Susan Hansen, she will be the moderator and she has a couple of students along with her. In a couple of minutes, she's going to introduce all of them. But I take the privilege to welcome Susan. She's a service designer, an experienced design researcher, and a product manager. She recently completed her PhD in the area of information and communication technologies for development at the University of Technology, Sydney, in collaboration with Rhodes University. The thesis was based on 3 years designing so her specialities are research and evaluation, service design, user experience, cross-cultural research and design, digital strategy, stakeholder analysis, product management, telemedicine. Uh, with this, I would like to hand over to Dr. Susan. Dr. Susan, welcome to Kocharya's Awake, Aware, Arise conference. Great to have you.
Thank you so much, Smita. It's such a pleasure to be here. Before we begin, I'm just going to share a slide and I'm going to ask one of my fantastic panelists to lead an acknowledgement of country for us, please. Ilham.
Hi everyone, I'm Ilham and I'll be doing the Acknowledgement of Country. We at UTS acknowledge the Gadigal and Gurungai people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our university now stands. We would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for those places and the earliest. An acknowledgement of country is an opportunity for anyone to show respect for traditional owners, and the continuing connection of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in country. It can be given by both non-Indigenous people and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia. And this means acknowledging our dark past and intentionally working on reparations and making amends with the Indigenous community. This is usually done as an introduction when people convene. And yeah, thank you for being part of that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ilham. Very much appreciated. So for people that are joining us now, you will have a couple of different options for how you can view us in today's session. I think the default viewing is the speaker view. What I was going to suggest for everyone, if possible, is in your top right, if you click on the button that says view, there'll be an option that says gallery. And I was going to recommend that you all switch to gallery view so you can see everyone in this panel session. But if your preference is to stay with the speaker view, then you can absolutely stick with that. It's just making you guys aware that that is actually an option so you can see all of the panelists that we have here today. Before I introduce our wonderful panelists, I know that Smita actually asked you guys to do a bit of an exercise by sharing where you're coming from or where you're dialing in from today, but we've got a bit of a Menti poll. I'm going to paste the link in the chat. I'm also going to share a screen here so you can either follow the link that I've added in the chat, or alternatively, if you prefer, you can go to www.menti.com and then enter the code 9540542. And we would like you to spend 1 minute answering the question, where are you zooming in from today? while you guys are actually doing that, I might add as well that I'd like to encourage all participants or the audience, if you do have questions, as we sort of share our various perspectives in this session, then please feel free to write those questions at any time in the chat section of our webinar. We will either get to them during our discussions, but if we don't get to your questions during the discussions, we'll make sure that we come back to it at the end of the series of talks as well. So please, everyone, any questions as you have them, feel free to enter them. Also, feel free to enter any kind of insights or reflections or surprises if you like as well. We'd be very keen to hear. Just changing that screen. I'm going to ask my panelists, are you able to see the Menti results as we're starting to have them? Yep, fantastic. Ooh, I like this. Fantastic. So Sydney, Australia, India, Birmingham. Wow, good morning. It'd be very early over there. New Zealand, fantastic. My room and home. Brilliant. So we have a couple of reasons why we wanted to start by actually asking the relatively open-ended question, where are you zooming in from today? We are curious to know which locations you are, where are you in the world, but also I think it's a nice example of where it's a question which may feel like it has an obvious answer, but there are actually multiple different ways that you can interpret that question. And there's no wrong way, but I think it's a nice demonstration that we have here, that some people answered very specifically with a city, some people answered with a country, other people answered with, you know, where their physical location is, and it's all completely legitimate, but it's a nice example of where relatively straightforward question, we hear that question and actually there are many different answers. So it's a nice little segue into our panel discussion and topic today, which is inclusive design and the cycles of privilege. And I'm joined here, and I might ask you guys to wave as I say your name. We've got a variety of staff and students from the University of Technology, Sydney. We have two fantastic science students, Bethlehem, give a bit of a wave, and Ilham. Brilliant. Then we've got two social justice warriors from our Centre for Social Justice and Inclusion, Diane, bit of a wave, and Mahal. And then we have from our Information Technology Division, we've got myself and Kim Neville. Hey, fantastic. So before I give a bit of an introduction to this topic, for those of you who are dialing in from around the world, I thought I might just share a couple of photos that start to put into context where and what the University of Technology Sydney is, which is where we're all working in our various divisions. So we are located in Sydney, Australia. So this is a nice little aerial shot of Sydney, and UTS has a bit of a reputation as being known as one of Sydney's most significant landmarks of this big brown tower building, which you can see in a little bit more detail here. Big brown tower building. We've also got a weird selection of buildings all around the city. We have, I think from 2019, we had around 46,000 students, of which back then, around 15,500 were international students. So quite a large university, quite a lot of diversity, I think, in terms of backgrounds. Our international student numbers have no doubt shrunk thanks to COVID more recently, but there still is very a large sort of range of diversity. And so as such, this topic of inclusive design and cycles of privilege is something that is quite top of mind in various projects. And what we have today with our fantastic 5 panelists are a variety of different perspectives and experiences on this topic of inclusive design, as well as cycles of privilege. One more exercise before we start to hear from the panelists. Sorry, I do feel like I keep sneaking these additional exercises onto you guys. If we go back to the Menti, I'd like you to start to think about, and if it's easier, feel free to use the chat. What comes to mind when you hear cycles of privilege? So again, if you refresh the link, hopefully that will refresh, and I'll just share this as well. So what comes to mind when you hear cycles of privilege? Opportunity for change, cycles that exclude people who don't have privilege, family, preferential treatment, colonization, better lives, any perception to be a superior being resulting from demographic, gender, or related other aspects, wealth access for some exclusion, othering systemic privilege, lack of diversity of opportunities. It's a really nice selection of responses. I think for those who haven't entered, then please feel free to continue filling in the Menti. So I actually want to begin our sort of discussion with the panelists with Bethlehem. So Bethlehem is one of our fantastic science students, and it was discussions within the context of a project that most of us have actually been working on that Bethlehem brought to our attention cycles of privilege. And that was really the catalyst, I think, for that being further on the forefront of my mind, and really shaped us deciding to expand this panel from just inclusive design to inclusive design and the cycles of privilege. So I want to begin by asking Bethlehem. We've started to hear some of the ideas from the audience of when we hear cycles of privilege, what it means to them. So when you speak about cycles of privilege with us, then what are you referring to?
Sorry about that.
No worries.
So when I think the first thing that we have to do is, before we can even establish a cycle of privilege or understand the concept, we have to be able to acknowledge that people are at different intersections in our society and therefore have different levels of disadvantage and congruently also privilege. So depending on where you are in our society and what intersections you come through, whether that be your race, your gender, your your class and things like that to consider. And that's when you think about where you fit in the cycle of privilege and what access to opportunities you have. So the greater access you have to opportunities, that increases your access to other opportunities, and so that continues. But this could also be shown for the opposite end of the spectrum. The more limited you are, the more limited your opportunities are, the more limited you get. So it's that cycle sort of continues as well. And so I think a really great example of me using my privilege and me being sort of in that upper end of the cycle is, as a student at UTS, I was able to start an African society because they were able to facilitate clubs and societies at universities, whether it's cultural, whether it's about certain topics and different interests and commonalities. And I was able to create a space for people such as myself who feel that we needed a counter space so we can feel valued and have a space to call our own, and to also be able to share experiences and commonalities that make us who we are without feeling as though other people won't understand us. So this created that sense of belonging and community that most African students needed. And in fact, we are a minority group, we're not really there. And to just sort of value one another, that in itself was so powerful. And so I think when I look back into the cycle of privilege and how I fit into this, being able to open opportunities for other people to increase their opportunities is a way that we can empower others, but also empower ourselves at the same time. So we're increasing our own opportunities whilst also increasing other people's opportunities to accessing that cycle of privilege. And so I think that just ties it together really well.
That's awesome, Bethlehem. So part of where it came up was we were having a conversation about designing services and access to support services in the university. And so I think this is where you first brought up the idea of cycle of privilege. Like, why is it important for us when we're designing services to consider that? Or what does this mean to people who are sort of involved in designing services or designing things for people?
Yeah, so I think the important factor is that although we do have a cycle of privilege, there's also the other side of the coin, which is when you have limited access to services, that also limits your access to other services as well. And so this makes it much harder for people who really need and who are really vulnerable at that time as well to access the services that they need. They literally can't. So that inability to access that one service that may provide them more access to other services, for example, is not there, which stops that cycle from happening. But this cycle is, I guess, exponentially affected by your ability and your limitations. So there's two sides to the spectrum, because privilege is not just black and white. There's a whole spectrum and it's circumstantial. So depending on the situation you're in, you may be slightly more privileged. There's a bit of fluctuation there, but that fluctuation is not great enough to automatically put you into that cycle of privilege. You have to be able to sort of have the ability to see it and also have the means to be a part of it as well. So there's two sort of sides of it as well. Did that answer your question? Sorry.
Yeah, fantastic. Just a question out to the rest of the panelists. Is there anything else that any of you guys would want to add, or any other questions that the panelists have for Bethlehem around that idea of cycles of privilege?
I think one of the things which I was going to just remind Bethlehem of was the cultural considerations, for instance, around accessing some of the services. I know you've spoken about that before, particularly in the current circumstance of, COVID and offering additional support.
Yes, so I think especially in a society, Australia tends to be very proud and pride itself on multicultural society, which means not just acknowledging that you know, a multicultural society exists, but also celebrating it in the right way. And so to do this, we have to be able to facilitate different ways of thinking, different knowledges, and different ways people access services as well. And so one of the major concerns is the cultural understanding of things as well. So personally for me, I come from a background in my culture when something is an issue, you're taught to resolve it yourself. You're not meant to ask for help, and you're not meant to look weak. You're meant to be strong in the face of any adversity. So you are meant to find your own solutions. Therefore, it's really hard to actually ask for help and access any services that you do need to access. And again, it also poses the question, what services do I actually need to access? What do I actually need help in? I don't know where. And so with the combination of not knowing what services to actually access and not having access to them in the most appropriate way for that culture to actually access them, whether it's the language barrier, whether it's maybe in a cultural setting it's different, maybe there's extended invitation for services usually. So depending on how they're used to accepting services or accessing those services, it just makes it even harder for them to achieve the goal of getting the help they really need. And a lot of the times they're in the most vulnerable situations that they're in. So it makes it even harder to access those services when you really need them as well. So I think these are things that we really have to consider, especially if it's in terms of accessibility to vital services, whether it's financial, whether it's health, or even just the smallest thing of being able to socialize with other people who look like you, or people who may understand what you're going through. So the smallest may seem very insignificant for some, but is very, very necessary for others.
Can I ask
Awesome.
one thing?
Please do. I was going to ask.
So I think also some of the context around that conversation, particularly from you, Bethlehem, is like, I think, you know, in a university setting, we're sort of talking about wayfinding through services and how difficult that can be, especially when, you know, you've got cultural considerations that maybe the people who designed the service didn't see. I think the other thing in particular that we've spoken about in respect to some of these conversations is also the first in family. So for a university setting, a university is very complicated. You know, we have this understanding that everyone should be able to know how to be in university, how a university operates, how you can reach out for help in a university. But yet when you're first in family, as many of Australia's multicultural community are, it becomes even that extra layer of hard work and alienation.
Yes. Alienation, isolation, and also not feeling like you fit in at all. I definitely understand that, especially I myself being a first generation Australian. I was born in Australia, but my older sister was actually born overseas as well, and I was actually the first to attend university, even though I'm not the eldest child as well. So there's a bit of a barrier there, and getting your foot on the ground is very scary initially, and I think it requires a lot of initiative, and it requires you to be doing a lot of the work, where I feel that services, particularly in university, should really cater to their students and really design them in a way that they do consider all students and all students from different walks in life, whether it be first generation students, whether it be international students, whether it be students that were born and bred in Australia but may have accessibility issues as well. So accessibility needs, as well. And I think that's a lot of the times that's what we really do lack. So thanks for bringing that to note as well.
Thank you so much, Bethlehem. And I just need to say as well that when we were looking at the services, and a lot of us are trying to take human-centered and participatory approaches, but it was really Bethlehem explicitly calling out that we can't just take for granted people kind of having that foot on the ground and that initial ability to be able to, or mindset to be able to access opportunities, and how opportunities then led to a certain privilege, which led to opportunities, which led to privilege, which has really challenged our mindsets and approaches to designing. So I think we're trying to ask ourselves these questions a little bit more explicitly, I think. And so again, that's something, thank you so much for sharing, Bethlehem. Awesome.
Thanks for having me share.
Fantastic. So there's an initiative which the University of Technology Sydney has been taking part in, which is called the Inclusivity Experiment. Sounds very inclusive. Mahal, what is the Inclusivity Experiment, and how does that fit in with this discussion?
Great, thanks Susan, and thank you Bethlehem for giving some really great context on this discussion as well. So the Inclusivity Experiment actually started as an experiment to see how we could design for inclusivity, and it wasn't just focused on the university, but it was working with the Centre for Inclusive Design, Canva and Remarkable to kind of try and create a space where people could think about how anyone in any field could design their product or their service to be more inclusive. And I know that both Ilham and Bethlehem have had some involvement in this, and Kim is involved in this at the moment as well. So we're very lucky to have everyone here. But this year, I guess, instead of keeping the focus external, we were thinking about, well, given the move to online teaching, how could we take a little bit more of an internal focus at UTS and think about designing inclusive classrooms, especially in online spaces? So a lot came out of this, and a lot of what what Bethlehem was talking about also was really nicely highlighted in this. One of the conversations that we were having with students, and in particular international students, was, you know, how can we help international students feel part of the, I guess, the community at UTS, especially given that lots of international students are studying overseas at the moment. And for first year students, they haven't been on campus. They don't have any friends at UTS yet because they've not had the opportunity to meet anyone. So part of it was thinking about, okay, well, how do we make this an accessible space and also a place where you're motivated to come? Because if you have no ties to that, it just becomes this one thing that you do online, you know, like you're not as invested in it. And we knew that there were likely to be higher dropout rates, but also, you know, there are concerns obviously for the mental health of international students. So there were some students who'd never been on campus before. There were some students who arrived just before COVID happened, and they didn't have the opportunity to actually meet anyone before we all had to go into isolation and kind of work from home. So they were quite isolated from their networks as well. And then we had international students who had been in Australia for some time, but still felt like, you know, there was a lot to be said about the way that classrooms at UTS, and I guess at universities in general, were being conducted. And so one of the things that came out of those discussions were international students and students, I think this really applies to, you know, culturally and linguistically diverse students in Australia generally, but is seeing tutors and lecturers that reflect their own identities, and how comfortable people feel in a classroom where they have a tutor who shares a similar identity to them, and how much it makes them feel like they can share of themselves in those spaces. So one of the interviews in particular talked about how so she was a young international student from China. She was a young woman, and her tutor was Filipino, but born in Australia and raised in Australia. But their discussions around race and racism really invited her to think about her own experiences with racism, because her tutor had been so open about, you know, as a Filipino Australian, the kinds of racism that she had faced. And this meant that her international students felt like they also could share in a way that was safe. And it really highlighted to us how important it is to have a diverse teaching staff, how important it is to draw on that diversity in all faculties, because it tells us a lot about who we think universities are for. right? So if you go to university and all of your teaching staff is white, that tells you something about who belongs in these spaces and who we've crafted these spaces for, and what is acceptable in these spaces, and what identities are, you know, revered in these spaces, and what experiences are kind of sidelined and marginalized. And this was a really great example of how that shared experience created a classroom where everyone felt comfortable and where people felt valued. They felt like their experiences weren't going to be diminished, they weren't going to be minimized, and they were going to be taken seriously. And so I think that that's a really important kind of, you know, that's an important lesson that came out of the inclusivity experiment. But one of the other things that we did was produce a kind of a series of videos that helped teachers or tutors and lecturers teach more inclusively, right? So it was kind of a package of maybe like 7 tips with pre-prepared resources that tutors could take into their classrooms and say, okay, well, I'm going to use this program to make sure that I include subtitles, or I'm going to teach in a way where, you know, I have quizzes in the middle of my lectures to reinforce particular points. One of the really interesting examples, and ones that have been really popular in terms of people picking them up and using them, were how we discuss our identities at the beginning of a classroom. And one of the tutors at UTS who teaches in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, her name is Zozan Bolchi, and she talked about this really interesting exercise that she uses with her students, which is thinking about how you as a person who has multiple identities reads the subject content through the lens of those identities, and really explicitly discussing those identities at the beginning of a class. So she says, I'm Turkish, and she speaks Turkish. She says, I'm German, she speaks German, and she also speaks in English, and that she will be bringing all of these identities. You know, she's a woman who migrated to Australia, you know, even though one of her parents is Turkish, the other one is German. She grew up in Germany, right? There's this very complex identity that she brings to the conversation, and she invites her students to dissect their own identities in the very first class, and says, let's try and see how we can use these identities to have these discussions for the rest of the semester. And it really changes the dynamic in the classroom, because Australia is one of those very interesting, and by interesting I mean deeply problematic, examples of how race and having, and, you know, being culturally, you know, from a culturally diverse background, or being a person of color, is often seen as a deficit, right? And so we often come at these models and these perspectives from the idea that people from non-English speaking backgrounds actually, you know, are operating from a deficit model, that we need to help them in some way, and not that language, or that second language, and that those understanding of, you know, different cultural values are actually an asset. And she really works from that asset perspective, and I think it's really great to see, and, you know, and that has been picked up. And so earlier this year we had a forum where we asked everyone who attended, so we showcased these different activities, and we asked everyone who attended to commit to doing one of those things in their classrooms, or they could commit to something entirely different. But yeah, they had to commit to doing one thing this semester, and then report back to us at the end of the semester to see, you know, whether they noticed any changes in their classrooms and in class participation. And we haven't yet discuss those results with tutors, but, you know, in checking in, I think people have been really enthusiastic about the kinds of activities that they were able to do with their students. Sorry, I've talked for a very long time.
That's awesome, Mahal. I've just got a really quick question before I actually ask if the other panelists have anything that they'd want to add, or any questions as well for Mahal. You mentioned that this inclusivity experiment is an initiative that's in partnership with Canva and, is it Remarkable?
Yeah.
And I guess those are external organisations, is that right?
Yeah, so yes, that's
Awesome. So what is that role that those external organisations have in this kind of project and working with our university and classroom context?
Yeah, that's a good question. I guess the way that we think about it is, how can we take what these other organisations do in terms of designing inclusively and apply it to a classroom setting? Like, are there lessons that we can learn from other industries and other fields about the way that inclusivity happens in a classroom, or the way that universities can think about inclusivity? And so I think in some ways it's more a collaborative approach, and part of what we would like the Inclusivity Experiment to become as it grows is a kind of community of practice, right, where people from all different fields and organizations come together to discuss the way that inclusivity plays out for them in their respective fields. But I think we don't want to underestimate how much we can learn from each other, and how, you know, and the challenges that you face in doing this kind of work. And it's important to have people that you can share it with and kind of brainstorm alongside. So yeah, I would say that's
fantastic. So would you say that there's getting that external perspective from other organizations that are applying these sort of principles and concepts in a different context and seeing what we can learn in a university, and then I guess by this community of practice, is it a bit of a two-way learning situation as well, potentially? There's a bunch of stuff we're doing in a university. What could you potentially apply elsewhere?
absolutely, that's exactly right. And I think we want, you know, we want our students to leave university having had a good experience, right? And so how do you make sure that that experience is good for everyone, not just for a select group of people? And, you know, and for lots of people, especially if you are the first person in your family to go to university, that's really exciting. And it should be something, it should be a memory that you have, that you know, that you cherish, that you want to encourage other people to participate in, because it was a good time for you. You learned a lot about, you know, your field or your degree or whatever, but also a lot about yourself, a lot about the world. And so I think, you know, you want to give people the best experience that they can have, because they deserve to be in an educational institution where they are valued. Like it's kind of a right that they have. And I think that that's the perspective that we try to operate from, that, yeah, these experiences are valuable, and we don't ever want anyone to walk away from that having had a poor experience.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Mahal. Is there anything that any of the other panelists want to add or ask of Mahal?
I think
Ilham?
being sorry,
Kim, sorry.
no, Ilham after you.
Sorry.
Ilham and then Kim. Yep.
Right.
Yep.
So Mahal, when the Inclusivity Experiment first started, there was this whole question about how are faculty going to perceive it, and are people actually going to practice it? What follow-ups have been made, and have you been met with any resistance, and how have you been able to deal with that?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Sorry.
I think we tried as best we could to get representation across different faculties, right, to get people to buy into the idea. I'm not going to say it's perfect, right? Like, I think that what we have is a small but engaged community. So the people who are there are really engaged and working really hard. Have we met with some resistance? Yeah, we have, because the way that these things work, I mean, like, I think that it's not really a secret that the structures of universities don't always support these kinds of changes, at least not rapidly. And I think that that is something that universities need to be really honest about, and need to decide how they value these perspectives and these, you know, like, is this a value that you have? If it is, then it means you need to invest in it. And I think that those are ongoing conversations that we have at a systemic level. But yeah, it's a challenge. There are some people who think, well, you know what, it's hard. It's too hard to do. And what we tried to do in putting together those 7, you know, resources was saying, we've done the work for you, just implement one of these. But yeah, definitely. I mean, not everyone bought into it. But we hope that over time, it is something that we will be able to grow. And I think as the community of practice grows, this is our intention, that as that grows, you know, you'll have more people where it just becomes the norm, and this is something people try and do. Thank you.
Fantastic. And Kim.
Although just a lot of what Mahal said really resonated, and I'm just thinking of, from a digital accessibility point of view, especially that point around assets and diversity as asset. And I don't know I'm just looking at the list of attendees. I'm just wondering if anyone can show their hands if they are digital accessibility focused in their work. If anyone does digital accessibility, just let us just indicate that it doesn't look like there is. And because the reason what Mahal was talking about really resonates is we really talk about people with disabilities as being the best problem solvers in the world. And if you think about it, every day you're solving problems. And Susan hears me talk about this all the time. And I know this conference is attended by, of course, people who are leaders in their organisation and people who are accessing leadership qualities and developing and all that sort of stuff. And I think it's been a really interesting time for the University of Technology Sydney because COVID, like everywhere else in other organisations, has propelled our attention on digital accessibility and has really made us think about what this experience is like, this digital learning and this digital engagement for people with disabilities. And we've got a lot of learnings from this. So if we think about in the same way Mahal was wisely talking about the lecturer who unpacks identities at the beginning, I similarly think about people like Rebecca. Rebecca is a persona based on our user research and our testing. And so Rebecca is someone who has been in the workforce for a long time. She's returned to university for the first time, her first semester being COVID. And she's been building her career. She is deaf. She has no hearing. And Rebecca is someone who actually doesn't speak sign language and doesn't have that communication assistance. So Rebecca's very dependent in her life. She's a very independent person, but she's very dependent on lip reading. And if you imagine things like operating or doing your teaching and learning over a screen, if she's suddenly sitting in hours of online lectures and the lighting is terrible, she can't access what's going on. And then all of a sudden, Rebecca is suddenly in breakout groups and through Zoom technology. And she's suddenly in this breakout group that she has no access to any of the people. She can't engage because she can't hear what's going on. So these are the kinds of things that we sort of picked up during COVID in terms of digital accessibility. And it does illustrate a little bit about what our focus is like around digital accessibility. And yeah, I think it's been a really interesting semester for us, as it would have been for other people, just to kind of launch us into this whole new level of engaging with people from diverse backgrounds, including people with disabilities, but also heightening that importance of inclusion. And I guess one of the things that I've been talking about a lot with lecturers and people who design content and design their courses for online is that if you include people with disabilities from the beginning, you are going to avoid a lot of problems later. And as a leader in an organization, it's really useful to be mindful of ways that inclusion and inclusive practice can help you avoid costly problems down the track that you have to retrofix and you have to retrofit. So I work in the area of IT systems and IT services. So it's very specific. But if we go through a whole project and program and we haven't addressed accessibility and suddenly we do some testing at the user acceptance point and we find all these problems, it's going to be a very costly problem to go back and fix down the track. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Kim. And we will be hearing more from Kim very soon, actually, around accessibility, which is a super important topic.
I think Shirley had a comment in there.
I was actually, yes, fantastic. I was actually going to say, so Shirley, you did ask, and we've had Diane's responded. So Shirley has asked, what happened to all the inclusive and support services established 20 years ago? Did they cease them? Good question. Diane, did you want to share your response? Oh, you're on mute.
So I think, I mean, look, I've been off and on at the university for quite a while, and Kim might also have some insight into this. I think it's that the services are there, but to some degree they've stayed stagnant and the needs have been changing around the services. And what we sort of found out during our recent work is that there's whole sectors of the university community who just aren't aware of the services. And we sort of discussed how easily that could go down into a communications campaign. But actually we think it's about more than that. It's about the approachability of the service and about how comfortable students are within the university in reaching out and accessing that. And so it's part of the university's responsibility to be able to identify those students and also reach out to them, you know. And so we're sort of talking about a broad scope of both like physical needs, cultural needs, you know, a broad, you know, our like broad diversity needs, not just any one pocket, but yeah, a whole sector. And of course, I think, you know, Shirley has indicated that with casualisation of the university workforce, it doesn't help that knowledge base, which is used to underpin a lot of that. And, you know, we would agree. And we sort of, at the Centre of Social Justice Inclusion, we like to be positive. We always try to sort of hold on to the positive lights and sort of think that this kind of period of flux that universities, I don't know about in other countries, but certainly in Australia, universities are in flux at the moment because of COVID, which is hitting the sector very harshly, along with a government that is not very supportive to the university sector. And so the universities are losing a lot of jobs at the moment. And what we sort of really hope is that that when that starts turning around for the sector, that what it will allow is a whole lot of young academics to actually take the place of some people who are no longer there, and that there will be a kind of generational change. That's what I'm holding on to anyway, in my optimism.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much, Diane. There's a really interesting anecdote that's been shared as well in the chat from, I'm really sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Vinita, who was saying that just before they joined the session, they were talking to a friend and wishing her happy birthday, and the camera was focused on the sky, and they kept asking, you know, why can't I see her? And her response was, I can't hear much anymore, and this video is important because I want to speak to you. So I chose to listen rather than show my face to you. It's kind of interesting anecdote there. Thank you for sharing that. Awesome. So Ilham, we've had multiple discussions about cycles of privilege, and I think you might have shared that you've got a bit of experience with the cycle of privilege. What does this mean to you, and how did you get in the cycle?
So that's a very important question. And before that, just to give you guys some background, you're not always in the cycle of privilege, and also you're not always there by default. So for me, I'm an Australian citizen, but I didn't grow up here. So I lacked social capital. I didn't have a network. I didn't have connections. I didn't have people who will tell me about jobs or opportunities, or you know, give me good recommendations about what I can pursue here in Australia. So for me, although I have many privileges, like my previous education, my upbringing, I was lacking that social capital, which is, you know, it's a matter of, do you have a job or not? Do you have access to opportunities or not? So when I first joined the university, there was this really bad, what's the word? Sorry. I just didn't feel like I belonged. It was something I really struggled with until I got an email with a survey. I filled that survey in, and all of a sudden I found myself roped into a project. The problem with that is that's a pro, but also a con, is that I got roped into that project and it kept opening doors for me. To this day, I've gotten so many connections out of that project, and I kept getting more projects, and which is why I know Susan, I know Bethlehem, I know Michal, I know Kim, I know Diane. It's all through that one project that I joined, and it was a similar experience for me and Bethlehem. Which now we know faculty in the university, when before I was struggling to even make friends, which is really weird for me because I'm a social butterfly, I'm an extrovert. So making friends has never been an issue for me. But in university, when you're surrounded by 46,000 students, you are invisible. And I feel like that's a very common experience, especially with our university, because it's not a small campus. It's this really large campus scattered all around the city. So it's very easy to get lost in there. And the problem with that is that one email I looked at, I could have missed the email and I wouldn't be sitting here today. I would have a very different life. So projects like that, which it was called the Students as Partners project, where students were level-head with faculty.
Oh, Ilham, we've
very empowering. It can change the trajectory of someone's life. It can change the trajectory of their career. It's about knowing the right people, and eventually somewhere you're going to get something out of them and you're going to be able to give back to them. So the reason I started working on this project called the Welcome and Belonging Project, and that's a project that Susan roped me in. I remember working with Bethlehem from another project, and I roped her into that project. And all of a sudden, me and Bethlehem and students like us, so I'm not saying faculty because you all are hired by the university, but students like me and Bethlehem find ourselves in this cycle of getting an opportunity because we got an opportunity, and it keeps on going. And the fact that we got into this cycle means that we're most likely going to remain as people with the first access to opportunities, whereas my peers, the rest of the 46,000 students, are less likely to get access to any of these these projects and opportunities, which, to be honest, are life-changing. It may look like something very simple to the university, but for us, it meant that we felt like we belonged somewhere in society. We felt like productive members, and we felt valued by the university. And it does make a massive change in how you feel about yourself professionally and personally. So it's definitely increased my confidence. And it's also it's been amazing. For lack of a better word, it's been wonderful. And just looking at Shirley's comment, I was just wanted to say something about that. So your comment was asking about the services that the uni offered. That's another thing. Not everybody. I had access to these services because I was in the cycle of privilege. So if I've needed to go to a doctor, if I needed counseling, if I needed to look for an internship, that cycle that I was already in allowed me that access. My peers, it's definitely not the same experience. And I feel like because I'm in that cycle, my university experience has this depth to it that most of those 46,000 students will never feel. They'll go to uni, graduate, and to them it would have been just this set of buildings where they go to get a piece of paper and leave. And it's just not a fulfilling experience for everyone. And this is why it's really important to acknowledge the cycle of privilege, which is once you're in it, you need to, or it's only the right thing to do because someone pulled you in. You need to find every and any opportunity to rope in your people, your community, people you know would prosper and would grow in that cycle that you've already been lucky enough to get in. Yeah, that's all I have to say. Doesn't anyone have any questions?
One quick question, Ilham, before I ask the other guys as well. In previous conversations, I think you spoke about these opportunities that started to open up after you responded to this survey. But I think in previous conversations, you'd mentioned that there's a certain amount of confidence and agency that's actually needed before you can sort of be confident enough to respond in the first place. And I was just wondering if you would be able to share a little bit about that side of the entering into this cycle of privilege and sort of what's needed in terms of a mindset or again, agency.
All right, so this is something for me that was sort of sheer luck, but I've always liked filling in surveys. But a lot of people read that email and don't respond, right? But thinking about it this way, that every email I get could be an opportunity for my life to take a very completely different turn. And also, it doesn't have to take that turn straight away. You're building connections, you're building a network. Those are people you may need down the track and might need you down the track. But it's looking at everything that comes your way or comes to your doorstep as an opportunity for growth, for just challenging yourself. And because of that, I've become more open to accepting any opportunity that comes my way. And so I'll just give you a quick example. The project I started with is called the DISC project. So it's developing inclusive science curricula, which Bethlehem and I worked with. And it was about working on the mindset of science faculty and teaching staff on how to make education more inclusive. So we worked with a group of 50% staff, 50% students. I think it was around 50 people in total. And it was getting down with the people in charge, trying to change things. That spiral, one of the staff members there asked me to work on this inclusivity experiment, which is what Michal is running now. And that just kept on moving. The benefit of that is if universities offer opportunities to students, so like projects or specifically students as partners projects, the university isn't just benefiting itself, it's benefiting, it's not just benefiting the students, it's benefiting itself. You're giving yourself a better reputation and you're building up your community.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ilham. Back to the panel. Is there anyone else that wanted to add anything to what Ilham was saying or have a question? Bethlehem.
Yes, I was just going to add to that just because through our experiences, I think it's really important to highlight that breaking the barrier in terms of your personal capacity to sort of be open to opportunities is really essential, because that's something that I definitely lacked in my first or second year. It wasn't until I got to my sort of further years and recognized the importance of that, and the ability for me to take up these opportunities was really important in me to sort of move forward and access that network and increase my social capital. But also it required me to feel like I belonged, and it required me to say, yes, this is for me, this opportunity is there for me, I am just as good as everyone else that is accessing this opportunity. And so for me to sort of overcome that imposter syndrome, but also understand that everything there is for me and is it is literally that. I think that's the important part, the fact that it is for me and it's okay for me to access this service. And so that was really pushed towards me, especially with the Students as Partners framework, as the traditional view of educator and student dynamic was shifted, and we were sort of at level playing fields. So yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that point, because it was really vital for us to be able to be in that cycle of privilege, and that's how it was a catalyst, really. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bethlehem. I've just noticed the time is flying. I wanted to now go to Kim. So Kim is the manager of human-centered design and accessibility at UTS. So we do, she's my boss. We work together very closely and very frequently. And Kim asked about today's session. She asked whether there are any accessibility accommodations that will be in this session. And I actually hadn't thought about that until Kim asked. Despite working with Kim frequently and despite caring a lot about inclusion and accessibility, I still forgot to ask or hadn't thought about that. Accessibility is incredibly important. Kim, I was wondering if you could share what is accessibility and actually how does it relate to what we're talking about today, inclusion and inclusive design, inclusive leadership. Why should we care? What is it?
Why should we care? Okay. Yeah, and there's a couple of questions there as well in the chat and the Q&A that we should get to that we might be able to address, but I think others will also be able to address with much higher quality responses than mine. But what is digital accessibility? I have a feeling there are people here tonight that know the answer to that, but basically, as I was describing Rebecca's situation, it's really about that inclusive practice that Shirley's talked about in her question there. If we do implement and apply inclusive practices to our design and to our what Shirley's exemplified here is the best practice models of courses. Yeah, so if we do that, it's true, we benefit everybody, and that is a hard message to carry, and it's one that we all carry in our lives daily and in our working lives. And it's really, unless people have the opportunity to step out of their comfort zone, and I think we're talking a little bit about cycles of privilege here as well, and have that experience somehow illustrated to them in a way that makes a difference, it's going to be very hard to move on. And what is digital accessibility? It is ensuring that basically that no one is disadvantaged with the digital experience that your organization or that you are delivering. So if you're delivering any sort of digital experience whatsoever, are you do you have mechanisms in place to check that no one is disadvantaged by the way that is being delivered? So for example, when we pop this video up later, are we making sure we're going to caption it? And are we ensuring that there are alternative formats available to people? And really, how do we do it is, and the best way to do it, and this goes back to Benita's question about how do we extrapolate these learnings into our everyday lives and into the external experience. It's really, I think, about ensuring inclusion from the start, and that may be challenging, but if we think about the relevance and what good looks like, or what Shirley's described here as best practice, if we think about what success looks like, so if Susan and I are involved in designing a system, a new system or a new app or a new interface, we know that we have over 2,000 students at UTS that have registered with disabilities. We know what assistive technology, what screen readers, what types of barriers people have to the digital experiences. Why don't we get these people with lived experience in at the beginning and part of the design process, which is exactly what Mahal, what Diane, and what Susan's initiatives make sure that does happen. And that's really best practice. And the sooner you get people in who are going to be using whatever it is that you're delivering, or whatever digital experience you're hoping to achieve, the sooner you get people in there, as much diversity as possible, the bigger the lessons you're going to learn. And as I said before, in the money speaks way, it really does save money later down the track. It avoids people feeling excluded from the experience, and it of course it avoids having to redo things later on. In terms of what inclusive leadership looks like around digital accessibility, I guess what I've learned in for UTS, we've only had this program of work for 1 year. And it's certainly been an interesting year to have it. And I think what we're learning the most is that we really need a strategy, and we need to understand what success looks like, or what good looks like for a digital experience for people with access requirements. And as I mentioned at the beginning, my biggest learning so far is from Susan and practitioners like her, which is inclusive design will make all difference. And I know it sounds like just words, but inclusive design for us means we get students in that have disabilities, that are blind, that have cognitive disabilities and mental health issues. And we run them through some of the prototypes of what we're thinking of. And we just observe what kind of trip ups and hazards people have when they're using the system. And that helps us design the system in a much more user-friendly way. And I'm sure I'm just talking to the converted in this room, because I'm sure you're all doing some of this anyway. So for me, what we could take away in terms of leading things is just clarifying our vision in the first place and trying to understand what is the context. So in Australia, 17.7% this year of people in the Australian Bureau of Statistics identified as having a disability. That's 4.4 million people. That's a lot of people that identify as having a disability. 76% of those people who identified as having a disability identify as having a physical disability. For UTS, for our university, we have a different situation where we have 5.5% of our enrollments are students identifying as having a disability. And most of that cohort are not physical disabilities at all. It's mental health and cognitive loading disabilities. And for us, in terms of strategy, it's about contextualizing that and making sure that our strategies are relevant to that situation. So a lot of it is around course design, making sure that basically content is formatted correctly, because that means that screen readers and other assistive technology, as well as people with cognitive loading disabilities, can navigate our content a lot more easily and more seamlessly. It gives everyone a better experience, no matter what your ability, so that you can start drawing the dots of how actually designing and implementing inclusively is going to benefit everybody. And it shouldn't matter in the end what disabilities anyone has, because people should just be able to come to university and have the same experience as everyone else, regardless of their ability, regardless of their race, their gender, their cultural background. All of these things should not be a barrier. That's the dream. And that's from a disability point of view, that's what's supported in legislation. Legislation does require that students are given the same experience to teaching and learning through their digital experience as everybody else, regardless of your ability. So as I said before, it's really about making sure that you have alternative formats to various artifacts that you're delivering, or various digital experiences, and just making sure that people are not disadvantaged who are engaging in your deliverables or in your digital experiences. Yeah. Does that clarify? That was a bit of a rant, wasn't it? Sorry about that.
So Kim, are you saying then, for those of us that may not be motivated value-wise in Australia, there are legislation, like there are legal requirements to actually pay attention to this?
Yeah, and looking at the list from your Mentimeter earlier, I don't know any of those countries that also don't have legislation. And Australia is actually quite behind in adopting compliance and legislation compared to places like America, who love a bit of litigation, and the UK, who are actually very strict for their public information. And in the UK, they're very advanced in their thinking around content design and its relationship to digital accessibility. There's some real world leaders in the UK on this. Yeah, so we don't want to be walking around the university throwing the legal books at people and saying it's the law, because that just makes people defensive. We want to show people why designing inclusively is actually a benefit for everybody, and we want people to feel the benefit of that and experience it.
Fantastic. But it doesn't hurt to have that additional motivator.
Yes,
for
we're
those
lucky.
that aren't convinced.
It is fortunate, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Diane.
I was also going to sort of say, like at the centre, we had someone who like had lived experience doing an accessibility strategy too, you know, so there is also that approach of actually putting those people in the driver's seat of delivering those pieces of work.
Fantastic. So is that an accessibility strategy that's outside a digital context? You're talking about a program context?
Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic. Are there any other questions or comments from the rest of the panel for Kim?
I think there's just that comment from Shirley. Kim, do you?
Should I read it out?
Please do.
Is that okay? Smitra,
Yeah.
do you want to read it out?
Who?
The question from Shirley.
Yeah.
So she says, this is fascinating, but a problem. Spent 20 years at Newcastle University as an academic and am now member of the retired lecturers. Too many promotions of people who were privileged but focused on bringing money rather than quality teaching and courses that cater for diversity and students with disabilities are best practice and benefit all students. I remain furious at how we have undone so many quality teaching issues.
Yeah, so I'm not sure I'm the best place to answer that, because we do have Dr. Hansen in the room, who's an academic. Susan, do you have any comments?
I mean, I couldn't claim expertise in this because my full-time role is not as an academic, but certainly from what I've noticed by being parts of multiple projects over the past few years, Shirley, I would say that your experience is not an isolated one and your frustration is not an isolated one, and we empathize I think with that. And I guess part of these initiatives and the projects that we're starting to talk about in some ways trying to see which of those fantastic initiatives that have been there in the past we can start to revive or go back to and bring back some of the stuff. So I think that it does contextualize your earlier comment around things that have been available 20 years ago. So I guess what we're doing as a group here, where we're looking back and looking forward as well. So we're not just looking to reinvent the wheel. We absolutely acknowledge that there have been some examples of good practice that have maybe been lost over time for differing, as the universities have become more and more commercial entities and sort of lost support from the government, so have needed to be a little more commercially minded in some ways, but then there's other things that have dropped off. So I think we're looking back to some of those, but then also looking forward as well, acknowledging that there's a changing landscape and new things that are made possible with technologies and thinking. So I think COVID's going to be, and post-COVID's a really interesting time where we're getting demolished and annihilated in many ways, which, you know, we're Australians, so I think a bushfire analogy comes to mind. It does really feel like universities are being ravaged by a big fire, which can result in a couple of different things. It can either be completely annihilated, or it can also be an opportunity for rebirth. And I think, you know, as a collective here, that's certainly the approach or the attitude that we're choosing to try to take, is looking at this as an opportunity to see what new saplings we can kind of grow and plant while the university is in this process of like needing to rethink itself, I think. Ilham, you look like you had your hand. Yes.
Thank you. So that was also a response to Shirley. Thank you for that, Susan. As a current student, from my perspective, the problem isn't lack of services. I think the university currently has a lot of really good services, a lot of good initiatives. The problem is, as Betty and Michal and practically everyone here would have mentioned earlier, it's lack of access and also lack of knowledge. So the majority of the student cohort don't know what's available to them. The university did this really great thing. I'm not sure when exactly it started, but I started my degree last year, so in 2019. And my experience was that in both semesters, so we run on 2 semesters, and my first and my second semester, I got a call from the university asking me how I was faring and also directing me to services, so asking me if I was feeling physically well, mentally well, if I was struggling in learning. And at some point I did say, yeah, I'm struggling to understand how to study. This is very different from school. And I got support to speak to a I think a learning counselor. So that's someone that teaches you how to learn, basically. And whenever I wanted support, they were there, but not everybody knows that. And I don't think that call reaches everyone. And it also comes up as a private call, so not everyone answers it. And I know, because I'm someone that always avoids answering private calls. I'm like, oh my God, who's calling me? But in my, I answered both times, and it was really good that I did, because both times it was an instance of connecting with the university and also feeling like I'm not alone. I actually have services I can access. But then again, that's a problem. Not everybody answers these calls, and not everybody knows these services exist. And the problem with having too many services, and some of them, they're really good, is that sometimes staff themselves don't know about them. And sometimes a lot of people who offer these services don't know about services that work alongside them that they can refer other students to. So it's having, and I think people have mentioned it a lot, pockets of services and pockets of funding in places, because if you've got too much to offer, not everyone can't know what exactly you have to offer, because an individual, like Betty mentioned, Bethlehem mentioned, an individual going through a rough time is the least likely person to go out and seek the most assistance. So, and I think the way we should look at that is, how do we make that those services available and also known to students when they're when they're going through an okay time, when they're not in a moment of crisis, so that when they are in that crisis period, they know where to seek these services. And that's just been honestly the concern, is because the services are there. There are so many incredible services, but the problem is access, and the problem is knowing about the services. So yeah, that's just my
awesome.
That.
Thank you so much, Ilham. Such a good point. I'm a bit conscious of time before we run out. I do want to make sure we've got time for, last but not least, Diane. So we are, if you remember back to the slide right in the beginning, the University of Technology Sydney is kind of smack bang in the middle of the city. Now, we're not a closed campus. We don't have a dedicated campus. We are rather a collection of buildings that are in a precinct. And so we're sort of smack bang in the middle of a bunch of different communities. And so I think we've been focusing on a lot of the initiatives that we have that are in the classroom and to do with students and staff and digital accessibility. But Diane, I was wondering, if you could share a little bit about what UTS is doing with some of our precinct communities, and what are some of those initiatives for designing for inclusion outside our actual teaching and learning?
So the other thing I was just going to sort of say, like in response to Shelley, just also a bit of context. Shelley, we're all professional staff in the room. So, and as professional staff, we're bound by different codes of conduct about what we can talk about freely and what we can't. So that might help you explain some of that conversation for you. So yes, thanks for inviting me on. I think like with understanding cycles of privilege and inclusivity, I think we've sort of taken the approach of first understanding our own individual agency. We've been particularly on journeys with that in the Centre for Social Justice Inclusion, and that includes our own power to change things and how we act as change makers. And then from that, as Susan says, the university exists in a fairly large city, the largest city in Australia. We're a distributed campus. We don't have boundaries. We don't have a nice green or big old heritage buildings. We're a contemporary university. And so as part of well as understanding your own agency is understanding the university's agency and power, and also resources as a community neighbour, because there's actually various communities that surround the university. We have another sandstone, what we call a sandstone university up the road. So that's like the oldest university in Australia, or the second oldest, I can't quite remember. And it's sort of a large typical university. And then we have some communities that surround us that are quite diverse. We're on the edge of Chinatown, and the areas surrounding the university have large diverse Asian cultures, as well as large international student population cultures. And then there's a little section of the community at the south of university called Glebe. And Glebe is like a small community of about 11,000 people. Now, remember, in Australia has quite a small population, but quite a large landmass. So Glebe also represents some of really Australia's complicated history with Indigenous Australia too. In fact, Glebe came into being when a parcel of land was given to the chaplain on the First Fleet of Australia, which was actually a lot of boats that colonised Australia. And so in completely the terra nullius way that Australia was, that sort of disregarded that there was a culture that was living here in Australia and one of the world's oldest cultures, they just gave away this land regardless of who was living in there first. And of course, as we know today, there was strong Aboriginal culture and people in the Sydney Basin. And Glebe actually has one of the remnants of that, which is an old ironbark tree, what is called a scar tree, that is sitting in the heart of Glebe and stand as, like in the Anglican Church, as part of the original parcel of land, which stands as a bit of a reminder for that. So to sort of talk to you a little bit more about Glebe's complicated history, is Glebe is surrounded by the two universities. And it's an eclectic suburb that's been home to a lot of great intellectual people, a lot of great bohemian people, and a great Indigenous population. It's actually still to this day got the third largest Indigenous population in a suburb within Sydney, and particularly in the centre of Sydney, it's one of the last remaining Indigenous populations there. The also thing about Glebe is that it's very unique. Not only has it got the two universities, but it's actually 1/3 of residents in Glebe are also what we call lower socioeconomic status. So they're often people who are living in social housing or who come from disadvantaged backgrounds of one shape or form. There's 1/3 of Glebe who is the opposite of that. And they're like quite wealthy. They're in the upper economic status range in our demographic surveys, and really you can see this divide in the community is happening between residents who live in social housing, which is, as years goes by, becoming more run down, and residents who live in these large mansions. And so it's a very interesting suburb, and largely the community really appreciates the diversity and is really protective over, you know, particularly the disadvantaged community that live there. They can see the richness and cultural richness that that community brings to the area. So this is, I just wanted to give you that bit of a setting, is that this is the area that the university was stepping into. And we stepped in there as a large, powerful university with lots of intellectual capacity, lots of privilege and lots of power. But we also had lots of resources to give to the community. So we also wanted to engage with the community and really understand how we could be a good neighbour for them. And part of that understanding was to listen to the community and to involve the community. So we didn't want to be like a university that just came and sort of said, here we are, and we've come to rescue you, and we've come to help you. We wanted to sort of really go to the community to sort of say, hey, hi, we're your neighbour, and we really want to understand how we can help do things differently with you. So I think that really essence is how we've really co-designed for inclusion. So we sort of have, we've been very much under a series of activities where we've been working with the local services who have the immediate trust of the community, and they've been particularly important agents for us as someone who doesn't have a lot of trust in the community. And we've also been working with individual residents and individual community leaders in order to try to bring their voices to light and to encourage those collaborations that are much needed in the community. So to give you one example of how we operate within a cycle of of privilege and design for inclusion within that space, is we very much focused on listening. And I'm going to sort of show you this through an example that we've been doing with older residents in Glebe. So we started listening to the community in order to understand them, understand what was important for the community. And we did an appreciative inquiry interview where we interviewed about 50 to 60 people 55 plus in Glebe from a range of diverse backgrounds to really find out what they loved about Glebe, what was strong and what was working. We took that information and we, in our university setting, we analysed it, we contextualised it. But we didn't want to do that alone because we also sort of thought that's an act of power as well. So we worked with community members and we actually got them to do some of the interviews. And then we also invited them into that process with us so that they could make sure that we had the interpretation of the findings correct. So it wasn't that we were sort of saying, thank you for the information, we're now going to go and take that away. We wanted to really make sure that we weren't, taking ownership over the understandings that weren't necessarily ours. So through that process, we then worked with those community members to understand it. They used their networks for us to be able to find out who to talk to because they had the trust within the community. We then initiated a co-design workshop with older people in Glebe because we really wanted to understand how we could support those. That was in February this year, and it was really important for us in this setting, particularly when working with across cultures and particularly with the Indigenous culture, that setting not be too formalised. And so we really tried to put some elements in there that made it feel more like an event and less like a workshop. So we had some music, we had some food, we had some, very creative exercises, and we sat down people together. We made sure that the residents in the room knew that they were the experts with the lived experience, and we were there to listen to them and hear what they had to say. From that workshop, we then ran smack bang into COVID. We were going to initiate a whole lot of exercises. So all of that became disrupted because doing community engagement work was very hard. And in particular, working with Indigenous communities were the most vulnerable in Australia. So to COVID and to the effects of COVID. So we had to be particularly careful working with older Indigenous people. To cut a long story short, because I know we're running out of time, what we ended up doing was delivering a digital mentoring program, because part of our research highlighted that 50% of people in the area, particularly those that lived in social housing, did not have internet access. And for those of you not in Australia, when COVID hit Australia, we closed down fast. People were not going out of their homes within a short period of time. People were not going to work and everything moved online. Now, this became a real problem for older people who were the most vulnerable, who felt that they couldn't go to shops and they were told they had to do online ordering. They were told they had to do all of their bills and get prescriptions online and do doctor's appointments online. And we found that really part of that cycle of privilege was the assumption that people had access to digital spaces and also could use digital spaces. So we went through this process of also understanding this need and trying to work out how we could solve it. At the same time, the university was actually also in this space where we had a whole community of students who were also facing hardship. They were international students who were not receiving support from the government, were largely stuck in Australia, couldn't return back to their homelands, not supported by the government, had precarious housing situations, and were isolated from family in what we know has been a very scary time throughout the world. So looking at these two problems, we were able to create a program that actually married them. And it was only through deep listening with these communities, through the survey, the phone calls that Elham mentioned before, that we were able to sort of say, is it possible to connect these students who want to connect with the community and who were also feeling isolated, to older, more fragile residents who didn't have digital technologies, didn't know how to use the internet, and were also isolated from their usual activities. So we devised a student employment program where we were able to hire a series of students. We went through a matching program where we matched them to older people in Glebe. And one-on-one, those persons found a buddy system where that buddy showed them how to use the internet. We had to make sure that it was all very COVID safe. And we matched those people on certain amounts of like-mindedness. And just to sort of show the impact of that, we have one resident who was our first resident who had some health problems, had suffered from a stroke, and he went from not being able to use a smart device to being able to use a smart device, connecting with his friends and family, which he couldn't do previously. And also then he ended up being shown how to use an app. He downloaded an app. He then started walking more because he was using the app and able to track the health benefits of that. And then he was shown how to go online and actually do a telehealth appointment, which he couldn't be actually do before. So there's one person who through isolation might have been quite lonely, even become quite ill in COVID, but was able through this mentoring program, through reaching out to universities and the university community, able to actually learn things that he didn't do. And if I can just finish on this moment, I'll just read you some of the letter that we had from him. He wrote it to his mentor. It had become desperately obvious that I needed a new I needed the new digital normal when I had the great good luck to be introduced to the UTS digital mentoring program. My life's experience of this world was elementary, Microsoft Word and phone text messaging. However, with a quiet, calm, persistent, supportive, reflective approach, Salman has been able to introduce the interactive digital touchscreen world of smartphone and iPad with the revelation of apps. Voice to text, camera, WhatsApp. Simply unbelievable, what a relief. The journey, oh joy. Coming from someone coping with post-stroke issues, this is particularly important to me, even life-affirming. So I think you can understand that by listening to people, you can really find out the knowledge that can actually start to make change.
Thank you so much, Diane. And I'm so sorry that we kind of squeezed you in terms of time. It's such an amazing example of acknowledging privilege, using that understanding towards greater inclusion, both in shaping process and shaping projects. And what a powerful example. Also great example of how you can work together with a group of people and know each other and know a bunch of stuff and still learn more amazing things. Diane and I have been working fairly closely on a project together and I hadn't heard that one before, and that's absolutely amazing. So
I will also sort of say we also were prepared for people with accessibility issues for that program too.
Kim is very happy. That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. I am kind of conscious that we've gone a little bit over time. Apologies for that. I just wanted to leave with two quick slides. One is a bit of a challenge to any remaining attendees that may still be here. And then I do have a final slide with some contact details as well, which I can leave up on there. Smita, is that okay if I take another 2 minutes?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine.
Okay, fantastic. Okay. So a bit of a challenge to the audience. So we've spoken a lot about the cycle of privilege and inclusion and various dimensions and aspects of inclusion, which can be cultural, ability, accessibility related, and we only just started scratching the surface of that, so it has multiple dimensions here. So our reflective challenge to the audience is, what is one thing that you could change in your life that could contribute to greater inclusion and widen access to cycles of privilege? So just a little bit of a light question to consider after this panel, if you will. And finally, we do have some of our details here as well. So we've got LinkedIn details for Kim and I. We've also got our UTS email addresses. So if you do want to get in touch with any of the staff to find out a little bit more, then you can email either myself and or Kim. And then Bethlehem and Ilham, please connect to them on LinkedIn. They are very keen, and actually I'll let you guys say that yourself, very keen to connect to other sort of like-minded people around the world and start to really grow and establish their network and community. Awesome. So I'll take that down. Thank you very much. It has been such a pleasure. Any last words from any of the panelists or Smita? I'm well over time now, sorry.
So thank you so much, Susan, and all other panelists. We've discussed inclusion before, but definitely that was from the organization perspective. It was great to hear from all of you from what the universities are doing, and especially you mentioned about the Australia University. So great. Thank you so good takeaways from this session. Thank you so much, Susan, once again, and to all other panelists. Great. Bye. See you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.